Good evening, good afternoon, good morning. 25th of October was declared SADC Anti-Sanctions Day. And ever since, for the last 2 or 3 years, I think now, all SADC countries have been celebrating or commemorating the day. I think this year, the Zanu PF will be doing the commemoration on its own. I don't think other SADC leaders, at least, will be interested in that. Because just 6 days later, on the 31st of October, they will be gathering in Tanzania to decide on what to do about Zimbabwe regarding the recent damning report by SADC election observers of the Zimbabwe 23rd August elections. Zanu PF has maintained that the elections were free, fair, and credible. The report from the SADC observers has made it clear that those elections were not free, fair, and credible. So I think by even calling this special extraordinary summit, SADC leaders have indicated that they're not going to sweep the report under the carpet. And so on the 31st of October, they will have to make a decision. The options are, they may just give Zanu PF a slap on the wrist and let them off the hook. Or they may have to stand firm and say those elections were not free, fair, and credible. And therefore then refuse to grant Zanu PF political legitimacy. What are the consequences of that? Well, the Zanu PF in the past has said, if, to quote Robert Mugabe, the late Robert Mugabe's speech, when faced by a similar situation, Zimbabwe will get out of SADC if SADC do stupid things, he said. I think Mnangagwa has made this position very clear, that he believes the elections were free, fair, and credible. And so we may be looking at him doing the same thing. And then, of course, SADC will have to take its own action. Some of the options available to SADC is for SADC to start imposing their own sanctions on the regime. So we've come full circle. SADC was holding the 25th of October as Anti-Sanctions Day, criticizing the sanctions that the West had imposed on the regime. And one of the reasons that the West had imposed those sanctions is Zimbabwe's failure to hold free, fair, and credible elections. And now we find ourselves in a situation where SADC itself have got to impose its own sanctions on the regime for the same thing, the failure to hold free, fair, and credible elections. It is ironic that the poster, as we can see here, reads, Zimbabwean sanctions were designed to subjugate the sovereign will of the Zimbabwean people. And so SADC will be imposing sanctions on the regime because Zanu PF, by rigging elections, Zanu PF is actually subjugating the sovereignty of the Zimbabwean people. By rigging elections, Zanu PF is denying the people of Zimbabwe a meaningful say in the governance of the country. That is the bottom line. And it cannot be denied. And I'm sure that once, of course, SADC has imposed its own sanctions, I don't think, even if we assume that the situation remains for another year, that SADC leaders or countries will be celebrating any other anti-sanctions day. Zanu PF will definitely be celebrating those anti-sanctions day on its own. Just as this year, I don't think we'll see any anti-sanctions day in any of the SADC countries. We should not forget that when the SADC election observers condemned the 23rd August elections as flawed, many of the SADC leaders did not turn up from Mnangagwa's inauguration because the elections were not free, fair, and credible. This is what we are witnessing here. This is what we are seeing all the time. Zanu PF is isolating itself from the rest of the international community. And this is the result of it. I've got one other story that I would want to cover before I I close the discussion. And this story relates to let me just set it up, sorry. To the very thing that I'm talking about here, Zimbabwe situation that it has put itself in, where Zimbabwe has become the joke of the international community. Here is a video recorded, I'm not sure where it was originally recorded.
Super nice chandelier. Baccarat crystal.
But this is somebody highlighting Zimbabwe, what Zimbabwe has come to be seen as in the eyes of the world, i.e. a big joke. I'll just play the video.
It's very nice.
It's the most expensive crystal.
Yeah, it is. I have a simple taste. Just buy the most expensive. Also a collector's piece. This is actually, it's a safe, but it's a designer safe.
Wow.
So you can use it as a mirror as well. And I didn't have the instructions yet how to close and open it, so it's open. And you open it, and
wow.
And I put here only for beginning 100 trillion Zimbabwe dollar.
We really have become the butt of jokes. The world is laughing at us as a nation. $100 trillion. Amazing. I bet you the day it was printed, it was probably worth $1 US. And by the end of the day, that evening, you probably needed 100, if not 1,000 of those to buy the same $1. And by the end of the week, it was worthless. This is what it means to have a worthless currency. By the time Zimbabwe abolished the worthless Zimbabwe dollar, inflation was believed to be 500 billion%. We cannot deny that Zimbabwe has got a serious problem, a serious leadership problem. We have not been able to solve it for the simple reason, I think if Zimbabweans had been able to have free, fair, and credible elections, we would not be where we are today. That is the most important thing. We are in this mess primarily because we have failed to hold free, fair, and credible elections. That point, you can never overemphasize that. Why is it that after 43 years, we still are failing to hold free, fair, and credible elections? The answer is simple. I think during those 43 years, we had many golden opportunities to end the Zanu PF dictatorship. Notably, during the 2008 to 2013 GNU. And yet we failed to implement even one meaningful democratic reform. Not even one. It beggars belief. How did we manage to do that? The truth is, of course, that those who were in a position to implement those reforms, i.e. the MDC leaders, Morgan Tsvangirai and his MDC friends, failed to implement even one reform because Zanu PF, Robert Mugabe, bribed them with the trappings of high office, and they forgot all about reforms. What I find disappointing is that many Zimbabweans out there, at the time, they had no clue that the principle, the primary purpose of the GNU of 2008 to 2013 was to implement the democratic reforms to stop Zanu PF rigging the elections. Worse still, even today, a decade since the end of that GNU, many Zimbabweans out there still have no clue what that GNU was all about. In the first part of this discussion, I referred to SADC leaders having this special summit meeting on the 31st of August. Sorry, 31st of this month, October, to discuss the results of the rigged elections. And I did say that one of the options would be for SADC to impose sanctions on Zimbabwe. If Zimbabwe was to accept, Zanu PF was to accept, okay, the elections were not free, fair, and credible. The other option would be for SADC to say, okay, let's set up an interim arrangement to make sure that whose primary task would be to implement the democratic reforms, to stop a repeat of this absurd situation where we keep having rigged elections. This will be the task that the GNU in 2008 to 2013 was supposed to carry out. What is disappointing here is that if Zimbabweans out there still do not understand what happened with the first GNU, what hope is there that a second chance to get those reforms implemented will be done if you don't understand what you did wrong in the first GNU? So we could end up with a situation where SADC affords us a second chance to implement the democratic reforms and get Zimbabwe on a democratic footing. And we waste it because Zimbabweans do not know what we are talking about. I'll talk of two instances. The first one happened last week. Mnangagwa was in Victoria Falls addressing this conference of chief executive officers chief executive CEOs. This is the cream. This is the leaders of Zimbabwe's big industries and companies and banks and so forth. The cream of the cream, if you want. And in that speech, he admitted that they were on top out of merit because they didn't have elections. If they had elections, they would rig elections. In other words, he was on top not because of merit, but because he rigged elections. And what surprised me is the entire gathering thought it was a joke. What a sickening joke it is. Just as this gentleman here is laughing at the $100 trillion, it is a joke to him. But to ordinary Zimbabweans who lived during those days, it was a nightmare. It was impossible to do business because of the hyperinflation. The root cause of the hyperinflation is the failure to hold free, fair, and credible elections. And of all people, this gathering, the cream of the cream, should know the consequences of decades of failure to hold free, fair, and credible elections and how damaging it had been to the country. And yet they thought it was a big joke. It really is sickening. It really is unbelievable. I think this is one of the problems we have in Africa. SADC will be looking around and saying, okay, who can we now trust to implement these democratic reforms? And of course, they should be looking at people like these chief executive officers of industries, of Zimbabwe's industries and companies and so forth, for that group of technocrats who would probably can be trusted to implement the reforms. But if that is a representative sample of what Zimbabwe has, I despair. I really despair. As long as Zimbabwe remains a pariah state, they can't even hold free, fair, and credible elections, even after 43 years of independence. In this day and age, we are not getting out of this mess. That is my message. And it is a pity that we are in this mess. SADC, I think, will be loathed to find itself in a situation where they have to impose sanctions on Zanu PF, knowing fully well that even if they were to deliver a healthy and functioning democracy on a silver platter, the chances are, if that is delivered in the morning, by the evening of the same day, the Zanu PF dictators and the other autocratic political systems would already be taking root. Just as the $100 trillion note, which made every Zimbabwean a millionaire, and yet it was absolutely worthless. By the evening, it wasn't even worth 1 US cent. And so we could end up with a situation where we get a democracy in the morning, and by the evening, we are back to where we are today, a dysfunctional autocracy. To be quite honest, I would say we rightly deserve it. Governments or people in general get the government they deserve. We in Zimbabwe, we cannot pretend that we do not deserve this Zanu PF dictatorship, because we have done precious little to earn anything else. Even when we were given the opportunity to end the dictatorship, we wasted it. We are looking at the possibility in 2 weeks' time of being given yet a second chance. But I fear to say that I don't think we'll be able to hang on to it. I don't think we'll be able to have a democracy in Zimbabwe, because people themselves are not ready for it. So we have become the laughingstock. Rightly so too. Those who do not take the trouble to learn from the past are destined to repeat the same mistake over and over again. So before closing, I'll just go back to the title of the discussion I had today. Zanu PF is commemorating the SADC 25th October Anti-Sanctions Day alone, because the other SADC leaders are thinking of the summit on the 31st of October, in which there is a distinct possibility they may have to impose their own sanctions on the regime for exactly the same reason that the West imposed sanctions on Zanu PF. How ironic. Thank you very much for listening, and good night.